Hello and welcome to this segment of Arts Talk. I'm Sherri Burr, and it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Geoffrey Miller, who is a University of New Mexico evolutionary psychologist, to our humble abode. And we are filming today in front of an audience of law students. So welcome, Professor Miller.
Thanks, Sherri. It's great to be here.
It's such a pleasure to have Professor Miller here, who's the author of 3 books, The Mating Mind, Spent, which is just this white cover, and Mating Intelligence. And he has been one of the pioneers, one would say, in looking at taking sort of Darwinian theories and expanding it into a whole nother level. So why don't you just sort of explain the overall goals of your research?
Well, our whole field of evolutionary psychology is really new. It's only about 20 years old, and our goal is to understand human nature. We try to do that by thinking about the kinds of challenges that our ancestors faced in prehistory, the last couple of million years. How did they survive, find food, forage, hunt, and particularly how did they find mates, form families, and protect and rear their kids. And each of those little challenges, we think, results in a whole different set of mental abilities and emotions that really form the heart of human nature. So that's what we try to do in evolutionary psychology.
Okay, all right. And I have 2 of my students who have gone through and read your books, and let me just start letting them ask the question. So we'll start with you, Tom. You read his book, Spent, so why don't you ask the question?
My first question is, you're an evolutionary psychologist, but your books are for a broader audience. So did you feel any compulsion to make them more interesting, or say audacious things that would create more buzz about your books?
I think in trying to bring science to the public, that's a really important thing to do. I mean, a lot of psychology is sort of a big research and development department. You know, if it was a corporation, we'd say we're really good at R&D, but we don't really have a shipping department. We're not that good at taking the research out to the public. And after all, the public funds the research. They pay the taxes that fund our grants and our salaries. So I think it's really important to get the ideas out there, not just to the educated public, but also people doing other areas of psychology, people in law, medicine, psychiatry, etc. Now, when you do that, when you try to communicate with the general readership, you do have to have little examples and anecdotes that you hope people will kind of connect with.
And one great example in the book, Mating Intelligence, is you ask the question whether Bill Clinton is a good example of mating intelligence.
Yeah.
And why don't you just elaborate on that?
Well, with the whole Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky blow up or scandal or whatever, it's very amusing for evolutionary psychologists to look at that, because we know that throughout history in most cultures, high status males have typically had multiple female mates, either multiple wives or harems, or they tend to attract a lot of female attention, even if monogamous marriage is the legal norm. That's very standard. The French, who are used to their male presidents having mistresses, are very amused by the whole Lewinsky scandal, right? So to us, that was kind of an interesting example of is that whole Lewinsky thing an example of Bill Clinton's intelligence or stupidity, right? From an evolutionary viewpoint, it's a good example of mating intelligence, because Lewinsky was age 22 at maximum fertility. Hillary Clinton at that point was postmenopausal and couldn't produce any more kids. So if you think of Bill Clinton as a typical high status male primate, his behavior makes perfect sense. But given the political context and American values, you could argue it was sort of politically stupid, even if it showed high mating intelligence.
Okay.
I had a kind of follow-up question to that, Professor Miller. It seemed like you talked about mating intelligence as kind of in 2 ways, where it was now, because of modern contraception, the goal in mating, I guess, in copulation isn't really kids every time. So how has modern contraception affected mating intelligence, and how has it evolved from what it used to be?
Yeah. Contraception is probably the single most important technology developed since agriculture, really. It's dramatically shifted the whole evolutionary trajectory, the whole system of the mating market, the amount of control that women have over their lives. So for the first time in the history of our species, women can kind of test different male mates without risking pregnancy, and only settle with a guy once she's sort of been able to assess his personality and character and moral virtues over perhaps months or years. So one thing it does is I think it puts a higher premium on those male mental traits and virtues, and a little less importance on, say, male physical attractiveness or muscularity or height or social status or wealth. A second thing, though, that it does is there's now emerging research showing that the pill or other forms of hormonal contraception do interfere with female sexuality that happens around ovulation. So around ovulation, women are more tuned in to a lot of aspects of men. Is his face symmetrical, body symmetrical, masculine face with a big jaw? Is he socially dominant and assertive? Is he verbally creative? All those things become more attractive to women when they're just about to ovulate, when they could potentially pass on the genes for those traits to their kids. The pill eliminates all those effects. And that means women may end up with a man who ends up being less attractive to them in the long term once they go off the pill. So that might worry Big Pharma, perhaps. They might face, I don't know, class action lawsuits by women saying, I thought my husband was attractive, but then I went off the pill, and now he's not. Right? And now I have all these kids of his who aren't as verbally creative or handsome as they would otherwise perhaps be. And how much is that worth?
Right,
Who
that's
knows?
what an interesting concept. And I know one way you tested this, I read an article about this in Psychology Today, was you had women smell men's t-shirts. So why don't you talk about that study?
So my PhD student, Ilanit Tall, really did this research, and it was about trying to see, are there ovulatory cycle shifts in women's scent preferences for men? The idea was, if you actually risk getting pregnant from a guy, it's important that he have genes that are a little bit different from you, so that your kids inherit an immune system that has more genetic diversity. That's an important predictor of your offspring's health and survival chances. On the other hand, when you're not going to get pregnant, when you're just sort of trying to have a helpful, supportive dad or stepdad even, and you're regularly having sex and you're in a relationship, then it might be okay if that guy's slightly more related to you. Not like a sibling, but maybe like a second cousin, okay?
So second cousins, I know there've long been laws that have forbidden intermarriage between second cousins, and that it sounds like that's because of the biological diversity issue.
Yeah.
But between first cousins, but second cousins, why is that? Why would that be okay?
Yeah. Well, so siblings share half the genes. Cousins share, a lower proportion of their genes. Second cousins even lower. If you mate with a cousin, like Charles Darwin himself did, right, then typically your offspring have slightly lower health and slightly lower intelligence than either parent had. But second cousins are fine, actually. Second cousins have enough genetic dissimilarity to you that they're safe, but also they have enough familial similarity to you, and you often know them pretty well, so that they often make pretty good bets as partners. So in many, many cultures,
Yes.
the second cousin is considered kind of a really good choice as a mate.
Yeah, especially, for example, with European royal families, don't they often marry second, third cousins?
Yeah, so the cousin marriages also help concentrate the wealth in one particular family line so that you don't keep dividing it up generation after generation.
Now, another way that you tested smell and women's scent and maybe male scent, was through the stripper study. So can you elaborate on what that study was about?
So there'd already been a lot of research in evolutionary psychology showing that women become a little bit more attractive to men when they're about to ovulate. So it's not just that women's preferences for men shift, but also women's own attractiveness becomes higher. That's especially important if you're trying to attract that extra attractive guy, right? The Denzel Washington or Brad Pitt or a law professor or whatever to sire your kids. So what seems to happen then is women become more attractive in terms of the visual appearance of the face, body shape becomes more attractive, breasts become more symmetrical based on water retention during ovulation. Scent becomes more attractive, and women's verbal creativity also increases a little bit just before ovulation. We wondered, that's great, those are all lab studies, but does it have any effect in the real world? Does it actually have a social or economic impact? So through the internet, we recruited Albuquerque lap dancers who work professionally in these sort of lap dancing clubs. They're acutely aware of how much money they make every night. And so we asked them to report their tips earned per shift, 5-hour shift, and also to track when do you have your menstrual period and where are you in your cycle. And the prediction was if they're more attractive when they're about to ovulate, they should get better tips from the male customers. They should be in higher demand. So it's kind of a nice economic way to measure attractiveness in cold, hard cash. And it worked. In fact, the women who were about to ovulate, if they were lap dancing, earned about 50% more than they did a week earlier or a week later. And of course, menstruating depresses your earnings even further.
Yeah, they earn like 100% more than when they were menstruating.
Yeah.
And then you also showed in that study the effect if they were on the pill on their earnings. So can you just discuss that?
So Sherri, we also found that ovulatory increase in earnings is eliminated if they're taking the pill. Because of course the pill eliminates ovulation, that's how it keeps you from getting pregnant. But by eliminating ovulation physically, it also eliminates all the psychology that goes along with ovulation. All of these mate preferences shifts and all of this increase in attractiveness.
It seems like there are a lot of ways that you could test that. I mean, would, for example, female professors get better course evaluations when they're ovulating, potentially?
Potentially, yeah. I think this has a lot of interesting implications for how women might schedule. When do they give course evaluation forms to students? When do they schedule job interviews?
Really, even job interviews?
Because I mean, particularly insofar as it may increase your verbal fluency.
Oh, okay.
Right, or general charisma, assertiveness. Incidentally, it also reduces mental health problems. So
Ovulation does?
Yeah, so women, for example, who have mild schizophrenia have lower rates of psychoticism or hallucinations when they're ovulating. So there are many, many ways in which they would become more attractive and more competent. So I think this kind of research may be helpful in sort of empowering women to understand their own bodies and minds and sort of scheduling their lives to actually take advantage of these factors.
Interesting. Tom, do you have another question?
So in Spent, you explained that evolutionarily we humans are equipped with everything we need to signal our fitness for mating, and that all this conspicuous consumption things that we can buy to try to also signal these traits aren't nearly as effective. And so what do you say to those of us who don't have any good traits? You know, that we need that. And, So when you're advocating more reliance on these evolved fitness indicators, how do you deal with the people who Darwin would say just don't get to reproduce? You know,
Well, whenever I start teaching evolutionary psychology to undergrads or grad students, I give them a little pep talk. And the pep talk goes, look, You all are here, you're alive. What that means is every single one of your ancestors for the last 600 million years has been an amazing success story. They managed to survive to sexual maturity, to attract mates, to rear offspring successfully. And you're unlikely to be the one generation that completely drops the ball, right, and loses the plot. Now that does happen, of course. Some people decide, look, it's a priority for me to make a social contribution, right, through my career or media work or whatever they do, rather than spending all my time raising kids, which is an enormous drain on time and energy, right? But in terms of being good enough to mate, right, the historical momentum, evolutionarily, is that everyone's amazingly attractive, both physically and psychologically, compared to our ancestors a million years ago, and compared to almost any other primate. And we're all equipped with these wonderful capacities like language, humor, creativity, art, and music that are romantically attractive. Another wonderful thing is most people are good at least one of these, right? Modern education considers those extracurriculars and doesn't emphasize them. You know, you must learn calculus first. But actually, if you invest your time in having a good sense of humor rather than calculus skill, that's actually sensible in terms of your own mating intelligence.
How has internet dating then affected mating intelligence? Because it seems like it separates out a lot of the factors that you're looking at, and you get just kind of a page. Is it just your people with lower mating intelligence are able to find mates that way, or is it just another example of mating intelligence at work?
Interesting.
Yeah,